The air in the practice room still held the lingering notes of the day's final piano lesson. Elena Vasquez moved her mop across the polished floor with practiced motions, careful not to disturb anything on Professor Harmon's desk. Westfield Conservatory was quiet at this hour, just past 10 in the evening, and Elena preferred it this way. For 11 years she had cleaned these hallowed halls, dusting the framed photographs of famous musicians, polishing the brass plaques with their important names, and listening to the whispers of music that seemed to live in the walls. Elena paused her work and glanced around. The moonlight streamed through the tall windows, casting a silver glow across the room's centerpiece, a magnificent grand piano. Her hands tightened around the mop handle as familiar longing bloomed in her chest. No one would know, she thought. No one ever came back this late. After a moment's hesitation, Elena propped her mop against the wall and approached the piano. From the pocket of her gray uniform, she pulled out a small worn notebook. The edges were frayed and the cover was soft from years of handling. She placed it carefully on the music stand and opened it to her latest composition. Elena sat down, adjusting the bench with the reverence of someone entering a sacred space. She didn't touch the keys just yet. Instead, she studied her handwritten notes, the melodies and harmonies she had created in her small apartment, on an old keyboard her grandfather had given her before he passed away. Just a few minutes, she whispered to herself, a ritual promise she made each time she did this. Her fingers hovered over the keys, then descended gently. The first chord filled the room, rich and resonant in a way her home keyboard could never produce. Elena closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. She played softly, mindful of the late hour, but with all the emotion that had gone into creating the piece she called Moonlight Memories. The melody spoke of her childhood in a small town far away, of her grandfather teaching her to play on an upright piano with chipped keys, of dreams too big for the life she had been given. Her hands moved with surprising skill, finding the complex chord progressions without hesitation. Time slipped away as Elena played, lost in the world she created with each note. She didn't hear the door open, didn't notice the figure standing in the shadows listening. When she finished, the final note hung in the air like a question. Elena sat still, savoring the moment before reality returned. Ahem. The sound made her jump. Elena whirled around, nearly knocking over the bench. Professor Richard Harmon stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the hallway light. I'm sorry, Elena stammered, shooting to her feet. I didn't mean to. You're the cleaning staff, correct? Professor Harmon's voice was cold, precise. His eyes, behind expensive glasses, moved from Elena to the piano and back again. Yes, sir. I was just finishing up. Elena quickly closed her notebook and shoved it into her pocket. Her heart pounded in her chest. In all her years working at the conservatory, she had never been caught. See that you do. The instruments here are for students and faculty only. He stepped into the room, his polished shoes clicking on the floor she had just mopped. These pianos are very valuable and very sensitive. They're not toys. Heat rushed to Elena's face. I know they're not toys, she said quietly. I was careful. Professor Harmon raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her response. His gaze lingered on the pocket where she had stashed her notebook. What was that you were playing? I don't recognize it, Elena hesitated. Just something I wrote. You wrote that? Disbelief colored his voice. He let out a short laugh. Well, that explains it. Explains what? Elena asked, even as a voice in her head warned her to stay quiet, to apologize and leave. The awkward transitions, the elementary chord progressions. He waved a dismissive hand. It's what I would expect from someone without proper training. The words stung, but Elena stood her ground. My grandfather taught me. He was a concert pianist in his country before the war. Was he now? Professor Harmon's smile didn't reach his eyes. Well, perhaps in his country the standards were different. He checked his watch. I need to collect some materials I left earlier. Please finish your work and move on to the next room. Elena nodded stiffly and returned to her mop. She worked quickly, keeping her eyes down, acutely aware of Professor Harmon as he gathered papers from his desk. When she finished, she pushed her cart toward the door. Oh, and Professor Harmon called after her. Let's not make a habit of using the instruments, shall we? These pianos are meant for serious musicians. Elena didn't turn around. She pushed her cart into the hallway, blinking back hot tears. The next morning, Elena arrived early for her day shift. She normally worked evenings, but she had switched with another janitor who needed the night off. The conservatory was different during the day. alive with sound as students practiced in every available room, their music spilling into the hallways in a chaotic symphony. She was mopping the floor outside practice room C when she heard Professor Harmon's voice from inside. The door was slightly ajar, and before she could move away, she heard her own name. "I found the janitor, Elena, I think, playing the Steinway last night." Elena froze. She should walk away, but her feet wouldn't move. "The older woman with the dark hair?" asked another voice, one of the graduate students, she guessed. "Yes, that one." "Can you believe it?" And she claimed she wrote the piece herself. Laughter followed, not just from one person, but several. Professor Harmon was not alone. "The audacity," someone said. "Was it terrible?" "Actually," Professor Harmon paused, "it had moments that were interesting, but wildly undisciplined. No understanding of classical structure." "Did you ask her to stop?" another voice asked. "Of course. Those instruments are not for the staff to play around with." "Oh wait, I think she left something." Elena's heart sank. "Her notebook. It must have fallen out of her pocket when she stood up so quickly." "What's this? Notes?" Professor Harmon's voice grew louder, as if he'd moved closer to the door. "Look at this, everyone. Our janitor fancies herself a composer." More laughter. Elena's hands tightened around the mop handle until her knuckles turned white. "See these markings? This isn't even proper notation. And look here, this chord progression is completely amateurish." "Maybe she's a musical genius in disguise," someone joked. "Like in those movies." "Hardly," Professor Harmon scoffed. "This is what happens when people don't respect the years of training it takes to understand music theory. Everyone thinks they can compose these days," the students murmured in agreement. "Let's use this as a learning opportunity," Professor Harmon continued. "Look at this measure here. This is exactly what not to do." Elena couldn't listen anymore. She moved away quietly, dragging her mop and bucket down the hall. Her chest felt tight, like she couldn't get enough air. The notebook contained months of work, pieces she had written late at night, ideas that had come to her while cleaning empty rooms, melodies she heard in her dreams. She had known, of course, that her music wasn't proper. She had never claimed to be trained. Her grandfather had taught her what he remembered, and she had figured out the rest on her own, playing by ear, writing down notes in a way that made sense to her. In the supply closet, Elena sat on an overturned bucket and buried her face in her hands. She wouldn't cry, not here. Not over the words of a man who had everything she had ever wanted: education, respect, a place in the world of music, and still felt the need to mock someone who cleaned his floors. When her shift ended, Elena walked slowly past practice room C. The door was open now, the room empty. On the floor near the piano bench, she spotted her notebook. As she picked it up, she noticed new markings on the pages, red ink circling what Professor Harmon must have considered mistakes, question marks in the margins, a large no written across one entire section. Elena closed the notebook and held it against her chest. For a moment, she considered throwing it away. What was the point? Professor Harmon was right, she wasn't a real musician. She hadn't spent years studying theory or technique. She was just a janitor who played when no one was listening. But as she turned to leave, her eyes fell on the piano. In the afternoon light, it looked even more beautiful than it had in the moonlight. Without thinking, she touched one key just barely. Not enough to make a sound. "My grandfather wasn't wrong," she whispered to the empty room. "Music doesn't belong only to people like you." She put the notebook back in her pocket and left the room, closing the door quietly behind her. Tomorrow would be another day. Another shift of cleaning rooms where others made music. But tonight, when she went home, she would play her keyboard and remember why she loved music in the first place. Not to impress people like Professor Harmon, but because some feelings could only be expressed through melody. And maybe, just maybe, she would write something new. Elena walked home that evening with heavy steps. The usual 20-minute journey felt longer as her mind replayed Professor Harmon's words and laughter. The cool evening air did little to ease the burning in her chest, a mixture of shame and anger that made her grip her notebook tighter. Her apartment building came into view, a weathered brick structure with window, boxes showing the first signs of spring. Elena climbed to the third floor, her legs aching from a long day of work. As she turned her key in the lock, she heard piano music drifting from the apartment next door. Her neighbor James Chen played most evenings after returning from his job at the local bookstore. The building's thin walls meant Elena had become familiar with his practice routine over the years. Tonight he was playing something by Chopin, one of the nocturnes her grandfather had loved. Inside her apartment, Elena set her bag down and moved to the small kitchen to make tea. The place was modest but clean, with second-hand furniture and walls decorated with framed sheet music her grandfather had given her. In the corner of her living room sat her most prized possession, the keyboard he had brought with him when he came to live with Elena's family after her grandmother died. As the kettle boiled, Elena took out her notebook and flipped through the pages. Red marks stared back at her, Professor Harmon's corrections like wounds on her music. She traced her fingers over the notation, over the melodies she had created without knowing if they followed the proper rules. Her tea forgotten, Elena sat at the keyboard and turned it on. The sound quality couldn't compare to the grand piano at the conservatory, but it had been enough for her grandfather to teach her everything he knew. Music is not just in the hands, Elenita, he used to say in his accented English. It is in the heart first. The hands just follow. She began to play the piece Professor Harmon had criticized, slowly at first, then with more confidence. The melody flowed from her fingers, telling the story of her grandfather's village by the sea, of waves crashing against cliffs, of children playing in summer rain. She played it the way she heard it in her head, not caring about the red marks or the rules she might be breaking. When she finished, applause startled her. Elena turned to find James standing in her doorway, which she had left ajar in her distraction. "Sorry," he said, holding up his hands. "I heard you playing and, well, your door was open. That was beautiful." Elena felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you. It's nothing, really. Just something I wrote." James's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You wrote that? I thought it might be something by one of the Spanish composers." He stepped into the apartment when she gestured for him to enter. "I didn't know you composed." "I don't, not really." Elena closed her notebook. "I just play sometimes. For myself." James sat on her worn couch, his lanky frame making it look smaller than it was. "That's composing, Elena, and it's good. Really good." His sincere words soothed some of the hurt from earlier. James was the closest thing Elena had to a friend in the building. They had helped each other in small ways over the years, collecting mail, watering plants during trips home to visit family. He knew she worked at the conservatory but had never asked about her music. "I had a bad day," Elena admitted, moving to finally make her tea. She offered a cup to James, who accepted with a nod. "Do you want to hear about it?" As they sipped their tea, Elena told him about Professor Harmon, about playing the piano after hours, about the mockery in the practice room. James listened, his expression darkening as she spoke. "That's awful," he said when she finished, but not surprising. "Harmon has a reputation even outside the conservatory. My old piano teacher called him the dream crusher because of how he treats students who don't meet his standards." "Which is everyone, apparently," Elena said with a small, sad smile. "Not everyone," James corrected her. "Just those who don't come from the right backgrounds or play the right way. People like us, like us." James gestured to himself. "My parents own a restaurant. They saved for years to pay for my lessons. But when I applied to the conservatory, Harmon said my technique was culturally influenced and not classical enough." He shrugged. "So I study literature instead and play for myself." Elena felt a kinship with James she hadn't realized before. "My grandfather was the only one in our family who played. He performed in concerts back in his country. But when he came here after the war, no one would hire him. He cleaned offices like me, but he taught you." "Yes." Elena smiled at the memory. "Every evening after dinner, he said music was in our blood, that no one could take it from us." James was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Can I see your notebook? The one with your compositions?" Elena hesitated, remembering the red marks, the criticisms. But James wasn't Professor Harmon. She handed him the notebook. He flipped through it carefully, studying her handwritten notes. "Your notation is different," he observed without judgment. "But I can follow it. It's like you've created your own language for music. My grandfather taught me the basics, but we didn't have proper books. So I made up symbols for things I heard." Elena pointed to a mark that looked like a small wave. "This means let the notes ripple like water." James nodded appreciatively. "That's what I heard when you played, that flowing quality." He turned another page. These are really good, Elena. Not just good, unique. You have your own voice. Professor Harmon doesn't think so. Professor Harmon, James said firmly, is stuck in a box, a very old dusty box labeled, "The Only Way to Make Music." He's forgotten that the great composers he worships were innovators who broke the rules of their time. Elena hadn't thought of it that way. She took the notebook back and looked at her compositions with fresh eyes. Yes, they were different. Yes, they broke rules she hadn't even known existed, but they were hers, born from her experiences, her memories, her heart. "Thank you," she said softly. James smiled. "For what?" "Telling the truth?" He stood up. "You should play at the spring showcase." Elena nearly spilled her tea. "What? No, I couldn't." "Why not?" "It's open to the public. You don't have to be a student." "But I'm the janitor," Elena protested. "I clean their practice rooms. I empty Professor Harmon's trash, so?" James crossed his arms. "Does that make your music less valuable? Less beautiful?" "No, but," Elena struggled to find the words. "They would laugh at me." Again, James's expression softened. "Maybe. Or maybe they would hear what I just heard. Something fresh and honest and real." He picked up a flyer from Elena's coffee table, one she had collected while cleaning the conservatory's bulletin board. "The submission deadline is next week. Just think about it." After James left, Elena stayed up late playing her keyboard with headphones on so she wouldn't disturb her neighbors. She played her compositions, trying to hear them as others might. She played pieces her grandfather had taught her, pieces Professor Harmon would approve of. The contrast was stark. Her music didn't follow the classical structures, the expected patterns. It flowed differently, speaking a language all its own. The next day at work, Elena moved through the conservatory with a new awareness. She watched the students rushing to classes, instruments in hand, scores tucked under arms. They looked so certain, so confident in their place here. Elena had always felt invisible as she moved among them with her cleaning cart. Today, though, she felt something different. A quiet knowledge that she shared something with them, even if they didn't know it. During her lunch break, Elena sat on a bench in the courtyard eating her sandwich and watching people pass by. A group of students had gathered nearby, laughing and talking about their upcoming performances. "I'm so nervous about the showcase," one young woman said. "Professor Harmon always sits in the front row with his little notebook, writing down every mistake." "At least you're playing Beethoven," her friend replied. "He loves the classics. I'm doing that new piece by Rivera, and you know how Harmon feels about contemporary composers. Probably the same way he feels about janitors playing his precious pianos," the first student said with a laugh. "Did you hear about that? Apparently he caught some cleaning lady playing after hours and totally humiliated her in class yesterday." Elena's sandwich turned to ash in her mouth, so everyone knew. Her private moment, her music, had become a joke throughout the conservatory. Was she any good? Someone else asked. Who cares? She's a janitor, not a musician. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Not a musician. Just a janitor. Is that all she was? Is that all she could ever be? As she stood to throw away her lunch wrapper, the flyer for the spring showcase caught her eye on a nearby bulletin board. "Performers submit your original compositions," it announced in bold letters. "All entries anonymous until after performance." Anonymous, no one would know it was the janitor playing. No one would judge her music based on her uniform or her job or her lack of formal education. Elena stared at the flyer for a long moment. Then with a racing heart, she took out her phone and snapped a picture of the submission details. "Not a musician," she whispered to herself as she walked back to her cleaning cart. "We'll see about that." 3 days passed before Elena found the courage to complete the submission form for the spring showcase. She sat at her small kitchen table, the form spread out before her, pen hovering over the signature line. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet apartment. "This is crazy," she murmured to herself. "What am I thinking?" Her phone buzzed with a text from James. "Did you submit yet?" "Deadline tomorrow," Elena sighed. James had been gently pushing her since their conversation, checking in daily, offering encouragement. His belief in her was touching, but it couldn't erase her doubts. She picked up her notebook and flipped through it again. Which piece should she submit? The one Professor Harmon had criticized seemed too risky. Her eyes fell on a composition she had written last winter, after a heavy snow had transformed the city overnight. Winter Whispers, she had called it, though the title existed only in her mind. Elena had never shown this piece to anyone. It was personal, written during the anniversary of her grandfather's death when memories of him had been especially strong. The melody was simple but layered with harmonies that shifted like snowdrifts, building to a moment of clarity that always made her think of sunlight breaking through clouds. Before she could change her mind, Elena wrote the title on the form and signed her name. She would need to translate her unique notation into something more standard for the submission, but James had offered to help with that. The next morning, Elena arrived at the conservatory earlier than usual. She needed to slip her envelope into the submission box before students and faculty filled the hallways. The building was peaceful at this hour, sunlight streaming through tall windows, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. The submission box stood in the main lobby, a simple wooden container with a slot on top. Elena approached it slowly, clutching her envelope, suddenly aware of her gray uniform, of how out of place she must look, the cleaning woman submitting music to a prestigious showcase. "Can I help you?" Elena jumped at the voice. A young man, an administrative assistant she recognized from the front office, was watching her curiously. I'm just dropping something off," Elena stammered. "Holding up the envelope. For the showcase?" he asked, surprised. "Are you submitting for someone else?" The assumption stung, but Elena didn't correct him. It was easier this way. "Yes," she lied. "For a friend." He nodded, accepting this explanation without question. "Better hurry. The committee collects the submissions at 9. Elena dropped the envelope into the box, listening to the soft thud as it hit the bottom. It was done. No going back now. As she pushed her cleaning cart through the music building later that day, Elena felt different. The same hallways she had cleaned for years seemed changed somehow, as if she now moved through them as two people, the invisible janitor and the anonymous composer whose work would soon be judged by the very people who looked past her every day. Near the practice rooms, she overheard two faculty members discussing the showcase. "Harmon's on the selection committee again," one said with a sigh. "You know what that means. Nothing but Bach and Mozart derivatives will make the cut." "I don't know," the other replied. "He surprised me last year by including that jazz-influenced piece. Maybe he's finally opening his mind a little." They laughed together as they walked away, leaving Elena to wonder if her piece stood any chance at all. A week passed with no word. Elena had almost convinced herself that her submission had been rejected when James knocked on her door one evening, waving a program. "You're in," he announced, grinning widely. "Look." Elena snatched the program from his hands, her heart racing. There it was, printed in black and white. Winter Whispers by Anonymous. It was scheduled in the middle of the program, between a violin sonata and a string quartet. "I can't believe it," she whispered, sinking onto her couch. "They actually selected it." "Of course they did," James said, sitting beside her. "It's beautiful." Even Harmon couldn't deny that. The mention of Professor Harmon brought Elena back to reality. "But now I have to play it. In front of everyone." "In front of him?" "Yes," James agreed, his expression serious. "That's the deal. You submit, you play. I can't do it." Panic rose in Elena's throat. "I've never performed in public, never, not even in school." "Neither had Chopin until he did," James pointed out. "Neither had your grandfather until his first concert." Elena shook her head. "That's different. They were trained. They belonged in that world, and you don't?" James challenged. "The selection committee, including the great Professor Harmon, just said you do. They don't know it's me. If they knew the piece was written by the woman who empties their trash cans, they would never have chosen it." James was quiet for a moment. "Maybe that's the point," he said finally. "The music was judged on its own merit, not on who wrote it. Isn't that how it should be?" Elena had no answer for that. She stared at the program, at her title next to all the others. Her piece, deemed worthy to share the stage with works by conservatory students who had been studying music their entire lives. "The showcase is in 2 weeks," James said gently. "That's plenty of time to practice. I'll help you. I don't even have anything to wear," Elena protested weakly, grasping at excuses. James laughed. "Now that's a problem we can easily solve." The days that followed took on a dreamlike quality for Elena. By day, she cleaned the conservatory as usual, eavesdropping on conversations about the upcoming showcase, hearing occasional mentions of the mysterious Winter Whispers piece that no one could attribute to any known student. By night, she practiced on her keyboard, with James offering suggestions on technique and performance. "You tend to rush this section," he noted one evening, pointing to a passage in her score. "Take your time here. Let the audience feel the suspense before you resolve it." Elena adjusted her playing, finding the right tempo. "Like this?" "Perfect." James nodded approvingly. "You're ready, Elena, more than ready." But Elena wasn't convinced. As the showcase drew nearer, her doubts grew stronger. What if she froze on stage? What if she made mistakes? What if people recognized her as the janitor and laughed? 3 days before the performance, Elena was cleaning the main concert hall where the showcase would be held. The stage was being prepared, the grand piano already in position, the same magnificent instrument she would play if she went through with this. As she dusted the rows of seats, Elena imagined the hall filled with people, students, faculty, family members, Professor Harmon in the front row with his critical eyes and ready pen. The thought made her stomach tighten with fear. Getting ready for the big night? Elena turned to find Mrs. Lopez, the head of the cleaning staff, watching her with a kind smile. In her 50s, with silver-streaked hair always neatly pinned up, Mrs. Lopez had been at the conservatory even longer than Elena. "Yes," Elena replied, not specifying what role she would play in the upcoming event. "Such talented young people," Mrs. Lopez mused, looking around the concert hall. "I love hearing them play. It makes all the cleaning up after worth it, doesn't it?" Elena nodded, a lump forming in her throat. Mrs. Lopez had always been kind to her, but even she wouldn't imagine that one of her cleaning staff might actually perform on that stage. "My son used to dream of playing here," Mrs. Lopez continued unexpectedly. "He was good too, taught himself on an old piano we had, but when he tried to apply—" She shook her head. "They told him he didn't have the right background, the right training. He gave up music after that." The story hit Elena hard. How many people had been told they didn't belong in these hallowed halls? How many had believed it and walked away from their passion? "That was wrong," Elena said softly. "They shouldn't have judged him that way." Mrs. Lopez shrugged. "That's how the world works, mija. Some doors open for some people and stay closed for others." She patted Elena's shoulder. "But we keep going, right? We find our own path." After Mrs. Lopez left, Elena stood alone in the concert hall, looking at the stage, at the piano, waiting for someone worthy to play it. Her own words echoed in her mind. That was wrong. They shouldn't have judged him that way. Was she going to let the same thing happen to her? Was she going to close this door herself before even trying to walk through it? That evening, Elena took out the dress she and James had found at a second-hand shop. A simple black dress, elegant enough for a performance, but not so fancy that she felt like an imposter. She tried it on, standing before the small mirror in her bedroom. The woman who looked back at her wasn't just a janitor. She was her grandfather's granddaughter, the carrier of his music, his dreams. She was the composer of Winter Whispers, a piece chosen on its merits by people who had no idea who she was. Elena took a deep breath and made her decision. She would play, not for Professor Harmon or the students who looked through her, or even for James who believed in her. She would play for herself, for her grandfather, and for Mrs. Lopez's son who had given up his dream. She would play because the music deserved to be heard, no matter who had written it. Elena called James to tell him her decision. His joyful response brought tears to her eyes. "They won't know what hit them," he said confidently. "Professor Harmon is going to eat his words." "Maybe," Elena replied, "but that's not why I'm doing it." "I know," James said, his voice softening. "You're doing it because you have to, because the music is in you and it needs to come out." "Yes," Elena whispered. "Exactly that." As she hung up the phone, a strange calm settled over her. The fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but something stronger had taken hold. A determination that had been building since the day Professor Harmon had laughed at her music. In 2 days, she would stand on that stage as herself, not as the invisible woman with the mop and bucket, but as Elena Vasquez, composer and pianist. And whatever happened after that, no one could take away the fact that her music had earned its place in the spring showcase. No one could take away the fact that she belonged. The day of the spring showcase arrived with golden morning light, streaming through Elena's bedroom window. She had barely slept, her mind replaying her piece over and over, imagining herself on that stage. Now, as she prepared for her regular morning shift at the conservatory, Her hands trembled slightly. Just a normal day, she told her reflection in the bathroom mirror, just like any other day. But it wasn't. By evening, everything would change, though whether for better or worse, Elena couldn't predict. The conservatory buzzed with activity when she arrived. Staff members hung banners in the main lobby, and student volunteers arranged programs on a table near the entrance. Elena kept her head down as she moved through the hallways with her cleaning cart, hyper-aware of conversations around her. I heard the anonymous composer is some kind of prodigy from the graduate program. One student was saying to another as Elena mopped nearby, someone who wants their work judged without their reputation influencing the audience. My theory is it's Professor Chen from the composition department, the other replied. She's been talking about exploring new styles lately. Elena bit back a smile. If only they knew the truth, that the mysterious composer was currently cleaning the floor beneath their feet. As she worked, Elena noticed Professor Harmon moving purposefully through the building, clipboard in hand, stopping occasionally to give instructions to students helping with the showcase. He seemed more irritable than usual, snapping at a young man who had placed chairs in the wrong position on stage. This is a professional event, not a high school talent show, Harmon said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Everything must be perfect. Elena ducked into a supply closet as he approached, not wanting to face him today of all days. Through the crack in the door, she watched him pass, his tall figure rigid with authority, completely unaware that the janitor hiding from him would soon be playing on his precious stage. The hours crawled by. Elena cleaned bathrooms, emptied trash cans, and polished water fountains, all while her mind practiced fingerings and transitions for winter whispers. By the time her shift ended at 3 o'clock, her nerves were stretched thin. She hurried home to prepare, giving herself more time than necessary. The showcase wouldn't begin until 7, with her piece scheduled for around 8:30. James had promised to meet her at her apartment at 6 to walk with her to the concert hall. In her bathroom, Elena carefully pinned her hair up in a simple but elegant style. She applied light makeup, something she rarely bothered with for work. The face looking back at her seemed both familiar and strange, as if the woman in the mirror existed in a parallel world where Elena Vasquez had pursued music, instead of taking the first job available, to help support her family after her grandfather died. Black dress transformed her further. Cut simply but with a quiet elegance, it fell just below her knees. Elena had found a pair of low heels at the same second-hand shop, comfortable enough to walk in but dressy enough for the occasion. A knock at the door announced James's arrival. When she opened it, he stood there in a suit, holding a small bouquet of yellow daisies. For the artist, he said with a warm smile, handing her the flowers. I'm not an artist yet, Elena replied, taking the daisies with a nervous smile. Not until I actually play. You've always been an artist, James corrected her. Tonight, everyone else will just finally know it too. They walked to the conservatory together as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city streets. Elena's stomach tightened with each step closer to the building she knew so well, but had never entered as a performer. What if they recognize me? She asked suddenly, stopping on the sidewalk. The students, the faculty, they see me every day with my mop and bucket. James considered this. Maybe some will. But with your hair up in that dress without your uniform, you'll be surprised how differently people see you. And if they do recognize me, then they'll be even more impressed, James said firmly. Now come on. We don't want to be late. They entered through the main doors rather than the staff entrance Elena usually used. The lobby was filled with people in formal attire. Students, faculty, family members, music lovers from the community. Elena felt instantly out of place, fighting the urge to shrink into the background as she had done for years. James seemed to sense her discomfort. He placed a reassuring hand on her arm. You belong here as much as anyone, he whispered. They found seats near the back of the concert hall. Elena preferred it this way. She could observe without being observed, at least until it was her turn to play. As they settled in, she scanned the room anxiously. In the front row, just as she had feared, sat Professor Harmon, program open on his lap, pen poised for notes. The showcase began with a welcome from the Dean of Music, followed by the first performance, a violin sonata played by a graduate student. Elena tried to focus on the music, but her thoughts kept drifting to her own upcoming performance. Her palms grew damp and she wiped them discreetly on her dress. 3 performances passed in a blur. Then the master of ceremonies announced a brief intermission before the second half, which would begin with Winter Whispers by Anonymous. "That's your cue," James said softly. "You should head backstage now." Elena nodded, suddenly unable to speak. She stood on legs that felt like water and made her way to the side door that led backstage. No one stopped her or questioned her presence. In her dress with her hair up, she looked like any other performer. Backstage was a flurry of activity. Student volunteers with headsets directed performers, and a small group of musicians who had already played stood chatting in a corner. Elena found a quiet spot near the curtain, trying to remember how to breathe. "Nervous?" asked a voice beside her. Elena turned to find a young woman with a flute case. "Yes," Elena admitted. "Very. First showcase?" When Elena nodded, the young woman smiled kindly. "You'll be fine. Just pretend you're playing alone in a practice room." "That's what I do." But Elena had never played in a practice room, at least not when she was supposed to. She had only ever played after hours in secret or at home on her keyboard. This was different. This was terrifying. "Are you the anonymous composer?" the young woman asked with sudden interest. "Everyone's been wondering who you are." Before Elena could respond, a volunteer approached. "Winter Whispers is up next." "Are you the performer?" Elena nodded, her throat too dry to speak. "Follow me, please. You'll wait in the wings until you're announced." With a last desperate look at James, who gave her an encouraging thumbs up from his seat, Elena followed the volunteer to the edge of the stage. From here, she could see the audience, the hundreds of faces turned expectantly toward the stage. And in the front row, Professor Harmon, looking impatient as he scribbled something in his program. The master of ceremonies returned to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, our next piece is something special. Selected anonymously by our committee, Winter Whispers represents a fresh voice in our musical community. The composer has chosen to remain unnamed until after the performance. Please welcome our mysterious artist to the stage." A polite applause filled the hall as Elena stepped out of the shadows and into the spotlights. She blinked against the brightness, momentarily disoriented. The walk to the piano seemed to take forever, each step echoing in her ears. As she settled onto the bench and adjusted its height, Elena caught a glimpse of Professor Harmon's face. His expression had changed from boredom to confusion, his eyebrows drawn together as he leaned forward in his seat. Did he recognize her? She couldn't tell. Elena placed her hands on the keys, suddenly aware of how different this piano felt from her keyboard at home, even from the practice room piano she had played after hours. This instrument was alive under her fingers, waiting, expectant. For a terrifying moment, her mind went blank. The notes, the piece she had played hundreds of times, vanished from her memory. The silence stretched, and she heard a rustle of movement in the audience, someone coughing, the soft scratch of Professor Harmon's pen. Then, like a whisper, she heard her grandfather's voice. "Music is not just in the hands, Elenita. It is in the heart first." Elena closed her eyes and found the music waiting there in her heart. She began to play. The first notes of Winter Whispers floated over the audience, gentle like the first few snowflakes of winter. Elena kept her eyes closed, letting her fingers remember the way. The melody built slowly, growing in complexity and emotion, telling the story of loss and memory and quiet beauty. As she played, the conservatory disappeared. The audience, Professor Harmon, the pressure, all of it fell away until there was only Elena and the music. The connection between her heart and her hands and the keys beneath them. She didn't play perfectly. There were small mistakes, a rushed transition here, a slightly missed note there. But the emotion, the soul of the piece remained intact, perhaps even enhanced by these human imperfections. When Elena reached the climax of the composition, where the separate melodic lines finally came together in a moment of clarity, she opened her eyes. The audience sat in complete stillness, many leaning forward in their seats. Even Professor Harmon had stopped writing, his pen forgotten in his hand, his eyes fixed on her with an expression she couldn't read from a distance. The final notes of Winter Whispers faded into silence, a silence so complete that Elena could hear her own heartbeat. For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. Had they hated it? Had they seen through her? Recognized the janitor pretending to be a musician? Then from the back of the hall someone stood up. It was James, his face shining with pride as he began to applaud. Like a wave, the applause spread through the audience until the entire hall was filled with it, growing louder as more people rose to their feet, a standing ovation. For her, for Elena Vasquez, the janitor who played piano when no one was listening. She stood shakily and bowed, tears blurring her vision. As she straightened, her eyes met Professor Harmon's. He remained seated, his face now a mask of shock and disbelief. Beside him, other faculty members were standing, applauding with the rest, but Harmon sat frozen, finally recognizing the woman on stage as the same one who emptied his trash can every day. The master of ceremonies approached the microphone as Elena prepared to leave the stage. That was truly remarkable, he said warmly. And now would our mysterious composer care to reveal themselves to the audience? Elena hadn't expected this. She hesitated, glancing off stage where a volunteer gestured encouragingly for her to return to the microphone. With her heart racing, Elena stepped up and leaned toward the microphone. "My name is Elena Vasquez," she said simply. "I work here at the conservatory as a janitor." A murmur rippled through the audience. In the front row, Professor Harmon's face flushed dark red. "I've worked here for 11 years, Elena continued, finding courage in the supportive faces looking back at her. "I clean your practice rooms and your offices. I listen to you play, and at night sometimes I play too. Music has always been in my life thanks to my grandfather who taught me. He used to say that music belongs to everyone who loves it enough to listen, to learn, to create. Tonight I wanted to share what he taught me with all of you." The applause that followed was even louder than before. As Elena left the stage, she felt lighter than she had in years, as if a weight she had carried her entire adult life had finally been lifted. Whatever happened next, whether she was fired tomorrow, whether Professor Harmon made her life difficult, whether people looked at her differently, none of it mattered. For one perfect moment, she had been exactly who she was meant to be. The morning after the showcase, Elena woke to sunlight flooding her apartment and the memory of applause still ringing in her ears. For a moment, she wondered if it had all been a dream. The performance, the standing ovation, the shocked expression on Professor Harmon's face when she revealed her identity. But the black dress hanging on her closet door and the program on her nightstand confirmed that it had really happened. Elena made coffee and sat by her window, watching the city come to life. Today was her day off from the conservatory, a small mercy that gave her time to process everything. Her phone had been buzzing with messages since last night, mostly from James, but also from a few numbers she didn't recognize. She checked James's texts first. "You were amazing. Everyone is talking about you. The dean wants your contact info. Is it okay if I give it to her? Call me when you wake up. You're basically famous now." Elena smiled, both touched by James's enthusiasm and overwhelmed by the attention. She wasn't used to being noticed, let alone celebrated. For years she had moved through life trying to be invisible, doing her job quietly, playing her music in secret. Now suddenly people knew her name, her story, her music. She was about to call James when her phone rang with an unknown number. Elena hesitated, then answered. "Hello? Is this Elena Vasquez?" asked a woman's voice. "Yes, this is she. This is Dean Powell from Westfield Conservatory. I hope you don't mind me calling. Your friend James gave me your number." Elena's hand tightened around her coffee mug. "No, that's fine. I wanted to personally tell you how moved I was by your performance last night. Your piece was extraordinary and your story even more so." "Thank you," Elena said softly, unsure how to respond to such praise from the head of the conservatory. "I've been at Westfield for 20 years, Dean Powell continued, and I've never seen anything quite like the reaction to your performance. Students are still talking about it this morning. Faculty too." Elena thought of Professor Harmon, of his red face and stunned expression. "All faculty?" she asked cautiously. The dean chuckled. "Well, some are more enthusiastic than others, but that's not why I'm calling. I'd like to meet with you if you're available. Today, perhaps." "Today?" Elena repeated, surprised. "Yes, I suppose I could. I'm off work." "Wonderful. How about my office at 1 o'clock? We have some things to discuss." After hanging up, Elena sat motionless, trying to make sense of the invitation. Was she in trouble for submitting to the showcase? Was the dean going to fire her for using the conservatory's pianos without permission, or was it something else entirely? She called James, who answered on the first ring. "There she is, The star of Westfield. How does it feel to be the talk of the conservatory? Terrifying, Elena admitted. The dean just called. She wants to meet with me today. That's great, James exclaimed. I told you people would recognize your talent. Or she wants to fire me for breaking the rules. She wouldn't have called personally for that, James reassured her. Trust me, this is good news. Elena wasn't convinced, but she agreed to text James after the meeting. She spent the next few hours in a state of nervous anticipation, changing her outfit 3 times before settling on a simple blouse and skirt, nicer than her usual day-off clothes, but not as formal as the dress from last night. At 12:30, she left her apartment and walked to the conservatory. It felt strange to approach the building not in her uniform, not through the staff entrance at the back, but through the main doors like a visitor or a student. The lobby was busy with the usual midday activity. A few students glanced at her as she passed, some with flickers of recognition in their eyes. A young woman with a violin case actually stopped and smiled at her. You were wonderful last night, she said. Your piece reminded me of why I started playing in the first place. Taken aback, Elena thanked her and continued to the administrative wing, where the dean's office was located. She had cleaned these corridors hundreds of times, but had never entered any of the offices as a guest. The dean's assistant looked up when Elena approached. Ms. Vasquez? The dean is expecting you. Go right in. Dean Powell's office was warm and inviting, with large windows overlooking the conservatory gardens and walls lined with photographs of famous musicians who had performed at Westfield over the years. The dean herself, a tall woman with silver-streaked dark hair, rose from behind her desk to greet Elena. Ms. Vasquez, thank you for coming. Please have a seat. Elena sat in one of the comfortable chairs facing the desk, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I imagine you're wondering why I asked to meet with you, the dean began, settling back into her chair. Yes, ma'am. First, let me say again how impressed I was with your composition and your performance. Winter Whispers showed remarkable talent and originality. Thank you, Elena said, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. I've been speaking with the faculty this morning, getting their impressions of the showcase. Many were particularly moved by your piece and by your story. And Professor Harmon? Elena couldn't help asking. A small smile crossed the dean's face. Professor Harmon has been reflective. It's not often that he's confronted with evidence that his preconceptions might be wrong. Elena nodded, remembering his stunned expression. But that's not why I asked you here, the dean continued. I want to offer you an opportunity, Ms. Vasquez. We have a program at Westfield for non-traditional students, people who haven't followed the usual path to musical education, but who demonstrate exceptional talent. I'd like to offer you a place in that program with a full scholarship. Elena blinked, certain she had misheard. A scholarship? For me to study here? Yes. Your job would be held for you if you want to continue working part-time, but the scholarship would cover your tuition and provide a stipend for living expenses. But I don't have any formal training, Elena protested. I taught myself mostly after my grandfather died. And yet you created a piece that moved an entire audience to their feet, the dean pointed out. Imagine what you could do with some structured guidance. Elena sat in stunned silence, trying to process the offer. After years of cleaning practice rooms, of playing in secret, of believing that the world of formal music education was closed to her, the door had suddenly been thrown wide open. There's something else, the dean added. We'd like your permission to include Winter Whispers in our next faculty concert. Professor Lin from the composition department was particularly impressed and would like to work with you to orchestrate it for a small ensemble. Professor Lin? Elena repeated faintly. The composer who won the national prize last year? The same. She believes your work shows tremendous promise. It was too much to take in all at once. Elena stared out the window at the gardens, at students walking between classes, at the world she had observed from the margins for so long. Can I think about it? She asked finally. It's a lot to consider. Of course, the dean said warmly. Take all the time you need. The opportunity will remain open. As Elena left the office, her mind whirled with possibilities. She had come to the conservatory today expecting consequences, perhaps even dismissal. Instead, she had been offered a chance to step into a life she had never dared to imagine for herself. In the main lobby, she paused, watching the flow of students and faculty. Did she belong among them? Could she really become a student here, after years of being invisible to these same people? Lost in thought, she didn't notice Professor Harmon approaching until he stopped directly in front of her. He looked different today, less imposing somehow, his usual confidence dimmed. "Ms. Vasquez," he said stiffly, "I was hoping to speak with you." Elena steeled herself. "Professor Harmon." He glanced around the busy lobby. "Perhaps somewhere more private?" Curious, despite her wariness, Elena followed him to a small courtyard just off the main building. A bench sat beneath a flowering tree, secluded enough for a private conversation but still within sight of the lobby's glass doors. Professor Harmon cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words sounding rehearsed. "My behavior was unprofessional and unkind." Elena hadn't expected this. She waited, saying nothing. "I've been teaching for 30 years, he continued when she didn't respond. "In that time, I've developed certain expectations about what makes a musician, about who can create meaningful work." He looked at her directly for the first time. "You proved me wrong last night. Quite publicly." "That wasn't my intention," Elena said honestly. "I just wanted my music to be heard, and it deserved to be heard." He sighed, seeming to deflate slightly. "The dean tells me you've been offered a place in the non-traditional students program." Elena nodded. "I haven't decided yet." "You should accept," Professor Harmon said, surprising her again. "Your work has raw talent, but it could benefit from formal study. The harmonic structures, for instance, and the development of the secondary themes." He caught himself, shaking his head with a rueful smile. "There I go again, analyzing. The truth is, Ms. Vasquez, your music moved me, despite my initial reaction. I heard something genuine in your playing. Something many of my students, for all their technical perfection, still lack." They sat in silence for a moment, the spring breeze rustling the leaves above them. "If you do decide to accept the scholarship," Professor Harmon said finally, "I hope you'll consider taking some classes with me. I believe we could learn from each other." With that, he stood and walked away, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts. She remained in the courtyard for a long time, watching clouds drift across the sky, listening to distant piano scales drifting from practice room windows. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a different future, not as the woman who cleaned these rooms, but as someone who belonged in them, who had something to contribute. That evening, as sunset painted her apartment in gold and rose, Elena sat at her keyboard, hands hovering over the keys. The day's events played through her mind. The dean's offer, Professor Harmon's apology, the student's smile and kind words. Her grandfather had always told her that music was a language that could bridge any gap, that could speak when words failed. Last night, her music had finally spoken for her, had told the world who she truly was beneath the uniform and the silence. Elena began to play, not Winter Whispers or any of her existing compositions, but something new, a piece about transformation, about doors opening, about stepping from shadows into light. As the notes filled her small apartment, she felt a certainty growing within her. Tomorrow, she would call Dean Powell and accept the scholarship. She would continue to work part-time, keeping her feet in both worlds until she found her footing in this new path. She would study with Professor Lin and, yes, even with Professor Harmon, learning what they could teach her while holding on to the unique voice her grandfather had helped her discover. And someday, when she had learned all she could, she would stand on that stage again, not as an anonymous composer or as the conservatory's janitor, but simply as Elena Vasquez, musician. As the final notes of her new composition faded into the evening air, Elena smiled. That was a future worth cleaning floors for, worth being laughed at for, worth fighting for. It was a future that, at last, she could hear clearly, like music waiting to be played.